Well, the leader of NATO's second biggest military shaking hands with the Syrian regime's most important foreign backer. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Russian President Vladimir Putin meeting in Moscow today. Well, it comes just days after Turkey launched its latest operation in Syria in a bid to stop the Russian-backed Syrian government from gaining control in Idlib province. Since December, Syria's government has carried out a large-scale offensive, displacing more than 1 million people. Well, last week, Turkey opened its borders in an attempt to pressure the EU to offer support. We are covering this from all angles. I want to go first to Matthew Chance, who's in Moscow, where these vital talks are taking place. Matthew, Russia and Turkey certainly don't really want a war over Syria, and it's clear that Erdogan at least wants a quick ceasefire. What does Moscow want?
Well, I think it's fair to say, Lynda, that neither side want to find themselves fighting face to face. Turkey is the second biggest military in NATO. Russia, of course, the main backer of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, is a nuclear power. And the two countries, as well as the broader international community, wants to avoid a direct confrontation between these two states. But we're at a point in Syria now where the two are veering extremely close to that kind of very volatile, very dangerous situation. In terms of what Russia wants, well, I mean, first and foremost, I think that Russia, as you say, wants to avoid that direct confrontation with the NATO military of Turkey. But Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, also wants to, preserve the prestige that he has garnered in Syria for the past several years, deploying his military forces there, backing his ally Bashar al-Assad. He doesn't want to see, a large-scale Turkish invasion of Syrian territory that the Russians would find very hard, along with their Syrian allies and others, to prevent without the deployment of very serious, perhaps even tactical nuclear weapons to prevent. So they want to avoid that at all costs. But, it's a balancing act that Vladimir Putin is engaged in, because the relationship that Russia has with Turkey is a very complex one. It's not just about the conflict in Syria. Yes, they're on opposite sides of that conflict, but they also have other really important economic and political relationships. They're big trading partners. Earlier this year, Vladimir Putin was in Turkey opening a major gas pipeline that's going to supply Russian gas through Turkey to southern Europe. They've got other economic interests as well. They're politically increasingly close. One of the big political objectives of the Kremlin is to try and put some distance between Turkey and its European and NATO allies by sort of siding up to it politically and supporting it where perhaps its European allies and others are not. And so, again, it is this very difficult balancing act that the Russians are engaged in right now to try and prevent, again, a big Turkish incursion into Syria, but also to preserve the other aspects of that complex relationship with Ankara. Lynda.
And it certainly is complex. We know, Matthew, that there was this 2018 deal brokered in Moscow. Just explain for us why that failed and whether that can be revived.
Yeah, a 2018 deal in order to prevent the two sides coming together in that kind of confrontation over Idlib, which is essentially the last stronghold of rebel forces in Syria. And those, dividing lines between the two sides, the distances that were meant to be between the sort of warring parties, the crackdown on what the Russians would say are terrorist forces inside Idlib, none of that was really fully implemented. But, the framework is still there. And even though we haven't heard exactly what's been discussed and what's been agreed, if anything, in these face-to-face talks that have taken place over the last several hours in Moscow between President Erdogan of Turkey and Vladimir Putin of Russia, I think the expectation is that something like that is going to be reinstated. It may not solve the problem permanently, but at least kicks that problem down the road a little bit to prevent an escalation of the situation from where we are now.
All right, Matthew Chance for us. Good to have you across it all for us from Moscow. Thanks so much. We are going to stay on this story because I want to go to Arwa, Damon, who's in Turkey right now. And Arwa, you've been covering this war in Syria extensively for years, and you've just returned from Idlib province. Just explain for us how dire the situation is there right now.
Well, Lynda, this is really what's at stake. forget about the politics, forget about the often violent maneuvers on the battlefield. At the core of all of this, and the focal point that needs to be what is the basis for any discussion, is how to protect Idlib's civilian population, how to create something that isn't just a ceasefire or some sort of a safe zone, but something that is really more sustainable, because all they crave, all they want is a life where they can feel safe, where they're no longer on the run, where they have something of a future for themselves and for their children, and where every day is not defined by whether or not they've been able to cheat death.
The children's smiles belie the depth of their trauma. The school is one of many sheltering the displaced, the blaring music temporarily drowning out the sounds of the explosions on the front line just a 15-minute drive away. Even at their tender age, they know death can come in an instant. Dara is trying to have fun, gingerly keeping her weight off her injured foot. I was eating an apple with my sister, and then the rocket hit us, she remembers. I looked, and I could only see dust and blood. That strike happened a week ago at the school just next door, where Dalat's family, along with others, were living. A rocket slammed into the schoolyard, killing 7 children and wounding many more. Dalat's father shows us her bandaged foot, grateful his daughter is still alive, agonizing over how he is supposed to even protect his children. I am used to the sounds of the planes hitting, Dalat says, but since we got hit, I'm scared of it.
They've been training the kids on what to do if they hear explosions or the bombings come close. So one is shelter in place. And then the other, though, is to follow the arrows painted on the walls to go towards the bunker.
It's not a real bunker, just a room underground that used to store the now dust-covered school books. The skies outside the town are painted with the streaks of fighter jets. In the early hours the next morning, a chicken farm being used to house the displaced was decimated, crushing many of those who sheltered there in their sleep, including children. Hospitals are overwhelmed, dealing not only with illnesses and disease, but the constant flow of the wounded. There is no sanctity here, least of all for civilian life. In the last month, Turkey has upped its military involvement, battering regime positions. This group of fighters we meet close to the front is mostly made up of young men who were in high school when Syria's revolution turned into a war. The Turkish presence is preventing the regime from advancing on the ground, 26-year-old Abu Saad says. Our fight is about defending the population, my wife, my children. But how to truly protect this population? It's not really in these fighters' control. It's in Turkey and Russia's hands. They, the main two powers, bartering for Idlib's fate. No matter what is negotiated, there have been too many promises, too many broken ceasefires, too many sham agreements. Pain haunts every street.
His son died right here. That's still his blood on the wall.
Muhammad was just 12. His older brother tells us they ran when they saw the plane, but Muhammad didn't make it. I tried to pick him up, but I couldn't, Hussein remembers. Muhammad died in his arms. Even celebrations are bittersweet. These women are shopping for dresses for their relative's wedding. But it won't be a lavish affair. It's not the sort of happiness where you invite everyone, the groom's sister tells us. It will be small with immediate family. There's just too much misery and fear that a big crowd will get bombed. Since December, around 1 million have been displaced, cramming into any empty space they can find, even this prison. The families here sleep with their clothes on, not knowing when they might need to run out. Marin's father was killed fighting years ago. He used to play a lot with us when he was alive, she remembers. As we leave, we come across what's known as the graveyard camp, for even the dead are displaced. buried as close as possible to the border with Turkey, in the hopes that at least they can rest in peace.
Certainly a tough situation there. And Arwa, obviously civilians are key here, but in order to get peace, there does have to be some sort of political solution. How do you see the situation being diffused, and what could possibly happen if the Syrian regime does advance on the ground?
That really is the core question, and a lot of that right now lies in the hands of Putin and Erdogan. Some will tell you that, the best case scenario is some sort of a safe zone or a buffer zone, but even that is not necessarily sustainable, because at the end of the day, what you have, if that is created, is yes, potentially sparing the lives of those civilians inside, but then forcing them to live basically as a trapped population inside a negotiated upon stretch of territory. Many analysts, many observers will tell you that this is not a military solution. There needs to be a political one. But right now, all of these different sides are on such opposite scales of the political spectrum. It's hard to see where they come together on the middle line. And what everyone is most terrified of, Lynda, is if there is some sort of a negotiation, or even if there isn't, that the bombardment will continue, that Assad's regime forces will continue to advance. And the civilian population there is terrified of this. They're not just afraid of the bombs and the bullets. They're afraid of actually living underneath the control of Damascus, because they are convinced that they will end up killed, disappeared, detained, as they say so many have in the past.
Oh, well, Damon, it's always so good to get your perspective on the ground. Thanks so much for that report. Well, Greek border guards are trying to stop migrants from crossing into their country from Turkey. Reports of violence are increasing, sometimes fatal. But this has done nothing to stem the flow of refugees who are seeking a better life in Europe. Lynda Kinkade reports.
We don't know her name. She's too distraught to speak. But you really don't need words to explain this gut-wrenching grief. Those with her tell us her husband was killed at the border. Turkey says Greek border guards opened fire on refugees and migrants gathered at its border on Wednesday, killing one and injuring 5 others. The Greek government denies using live ammunition and calls it fake news fabricated by Turkey. But it's not just the Turkish government making these accusations.
We're not allowed past this police line, but the situation seems chaotic. We've seen several ambulances coming in and out.
This man made it out of the area where thousands are gathered by the border fence. He says they were protesting peacefully. They said go away, then they shot at us, he says. The Greek government is openly firing live ammunition, an accusation Greece categorically denies. We spoke with a Syrian refugee who also says he witnessed the incident.
He saw one person, he says, hit in the chest by a tear gas canister. Hayır Sas, we're also hearing pops of, it's unclear what's being fired and who's firing what.
At the local hospital where the injured were taken, Turkish health officials are keen to show us a photo of a bullet they claim was removed from one of the wounded.
Because the Greek side is saying they didn't use live ammunition, they did not use bullets.
We have removed it. Yeah.
30-year-old Zashar Omar, a Pakistani laborer, says he saw people gathered at the border fence. He thought that they might be opening the gate to enter Greece, so he ran up. This mobile phone footage shows Omar being carried away moments after he was shot in the leg. All he wanted, he says, was a better life.
Pakistan not working, no business, no job.
Back at the border, a steady stream of new arrivals, undeterred by the news of violence and Europe's determination to keep them out. Some say they know Turkey's using them as leverage, trying to get more support from Europe. People so desperate for a different life that they're willing to risk everything for this uncertainty. Lynda Kinkade, CNN, on the Turkish-Greek border.
Well, from one front line to another, our Phil Black is on the Greek island of Lesbos, where conditions are reaching breaking point. Migrants are living in squalor as they wait for passage onto the mainland in the hope of a better future.
This is where most migrants on Lesbos must stay, the now sprawling Moria camp. Designed for a touch over 2,000 people, the current population is 18,000. Most live among olive trees in handmade shelters without running water, sanitation, electricity. It's a slum. Is your child? Baby? It is no place for a newborn. No place for 3-week-old Adrian to start his life.
Well, Phil Black will be bringing us fresh updates on the situation in the next hour. In the meantime, for the latest on the strange situation in Lesbos, head to CNN.com. You can watch the rest of Phil's report right here at the heart of the crisis. We're watching CNN. This is Connect the World. We're going to be right back after a very short break with much more news.